Hello, welcome back to our AZ-500 Azure Security Engineer study series. Right, so on this video or on this part, we will be studying the first skills to be measured. That's about managing identity and access in Azure AD. So it actually have the the I think that's the largest percentage of potential question or topics that could be in the exam. So I think I will be splitting up this video in different parts, just not to make the individual videos so long and then it gets boring, you know. So yeah, so let's see what are we going to learn, what are the skills that we need to learn within manage identity and access. All right. So manage identity and access are also, you know, cut into different parts. Oops, let me go back to that. Those parts are, the skills to learn in manage Azure Active Directory identities, securing access using Azure AD, application access, and access control. I believe in this single video we will be tackling these two if the time allows, or if it doesn't really stretch that much. I'll see that on editing. Now in manage Azure Active Directory identities, we will be discussing about users, groups, administrative units, templates, not templates, so administrative units, and actually the where most important one is an introduction to Azure AD. All right, and then on securing access by using Azure AD, I'm not sure if it's gonna be if we can fit it in one part, but that would be the features that Azure AD have, how we can use Azure AD to secure access in your organization data. So that could be, I mean, if you heard of it, MFA, multi-factor. There's also self-password resets or management. So those are some topics that we will be discussing under secure access by using Azure AD. Okay, so at this moment, let's focus on those two. Now let's move on to our whiteboard. Okay, now managing Azure Active Directory identities. So before we begin, let's identify what is Azure Active Directory. So as you know, Active Directory, you've been using it in a Windows server, then you install the Active Directory domain services. The Azure Active Directory, it's fully cloud, and you don't need to put up a server, make a domain controller like the local AD. So let's see what is this. So according to Microsoft, Azure AD is, so Azure AD is a multi-tenant cloud-based and cloud-based directory and identity management service. Now, the keywords there is it's multi-tenant, so which means you can use the same. So let's say you have AD1 here, or AAD for Azure AD, and you could have multiple Azure tenants So let's say AZ1, AZ2, AZ3, and 4. So that means they can use that same directory um, for all those tenants. So, but you can't do the other way around, like multiple AD to a single tenant. That's not supported. Okay, so that's a multi-tenant directory. And other keyword is it's cloud-based. Yes, so we all know that now. And it's a directory and identity management service. So in short term, it's an identity provider. Identity provider. Okay, so just it's very similar to the local AD or on-premise AD. Just it's just like there are differences. One of them is the cloud-based. So on-premise is local, Azure AD is cloud-based. Now, before we compare these two a bit more, let's see what are the features or identity management capabilities of an Azure Active Directory. Let me just clear my board. Okay, so Azure AD can do the following. First is MFA, multi-factor authentication. I'm sure you're aware of that or you have came across that one. We will be discussing what options do we have in Azure AD later on in this series. Can do device registration. Okay, so in local AD, you do domain join. So that's when you have a new computer, then you join it to the domain, to the local domain. So in Azure AD, they call that device registration. So it's a bit different. I'm not sure if I think it's gonna be, I'm not sure if we will be tackling Intune throughout the series, but let's see. Intune is the MDM solution of Microsoft. So it integrates with Azure AD device registrations. So yeah, it's interesting as well. So let's see if we're gonna tackle that or we're gonna hear that word in the future in this series. And there are also self-services, like self-service features for passwords or group management. Now this is something the local AD can't do. Like let's say you have a group and you can just assign a user, like a normal user, not an admin, to manage that group. And also the self-password reset. That's a very useful feature in Azure AD that could actually, it could lessen the the ticket queue in your help desk. So instead of the user contacting your IT admins to reset their password, they can do it by themselves. In Azure AD, there's also PIM, which is a privilege. No, that's not PIM actually. Privilege account management. So it's more like your admin roles, but a bit more granular and a bit more specific. You can also do RBAC, so that's role-based access control. We will be tackling these topics later on. Sorry about my penmanship. It can also do application usage monitoring. as you know, in Azure AD, you can register your application. Oops. So, so this is like an equivalent of creating an application object. Let's say you are developing something and you want to use Azure AD as the identity provider. You can register application in Azure AD and then do an actual usage monitoring for your application. Another thing is Azure AD have a robust auditing, secure and security monitoring. I remember before in local ADs or in an on-prem AD, you have to, you have to buy a third-party app only to monitor, monitor AD objects or do some security monitoring, which is not bad actually, but I mean in Azure AD, it it do that by itself. So it's it's a win-win situation if you're using Azure Active Directory. And another thing is the integration. One of the most popular, or is for the sake of exam, on-premise AD can be integrated to Azure AD. So we will be tackling that later on. It is made possible by Azure AD Connect feature. So it's a very nice feature. It allows IT admins to migrate um, or even, set up a hybrid Active Directory which uses both local AD and Azure AD, and they do sync like to each other. So we're gonna discuss that later on in depth. So yeah, let's move on to our next topic. Okay, so our next topic would be Azure AD Editions. There might be some few questions that pops up in the exam, so let's have a look on this one. So Azure AD Editions, these are let's call it plans. So, when you buy some subscriptions, there are plans. Now, the first one is the free edition. In free edition, we do get, basic features with access to directory objects. We can do SSO, which is actually, that's good. That's single sign-on. And then some identity and access management. So that's, you can create users, you can create groups, you can assign roles to users as well, which is really, good. I think with this free edition, we're good to, you're good to, you can set up, you can play with it. It's a good starting point for studying Azure AD. But later on, we should, so when you create, that Azure free trial, that free trial subscription. So when you get a free trial, you get Azure AD free, if I'm not mistaken. Let me know if if that's not correct. Um, put it in the comments below. But if you do pay as you go, I think you get a full version of AD. Um, yeah, but let me know if that's wrong, or I'm gonna confirm it in the comment sections below if to just clarify that. The second edition is an M365 app. So now it's all of the free version feature plus the capability to use it as identity and access management solution for your Office 365 apps. So it's like a built-in directory for your Office 365 apps such as SharePoint, your Teams, or OneDrive as well. By the way, I'm using that I&A as identity and access. I just don't want to type. I just don't want to type it all the time. Okay. Now, these next two editions are the premium ones. So this is more likely it should be used in a corporate scenario, in a corporate setup. So we do have P1 and P2. So P1 that actually includes some, they call it premium features. So what are the premium features? That's actually, conditional access. So you will be able to use dynamic groups. There's also, so you can do password protections, password protections. These are some built-in features when you have a P1 license. And you can also use, with the P1, you can use like, sorry. So when you can do dynamic groups, we'll tackle this later on. So that dynamic groups, you can do dynamic users or dynamic devices. That's a very cool feature. I'm going to show that later on. And on P2, so that's everything that P1 have and free M365. So in P2, that's all of it plus more security features. So there's not much difference. It's just P2 allows you to use of Azure AD's security features. I think this is a very good one. It's a risk account detection. So it will be a built-in security feature in a P2 license Azure AD. You're gonna also have access to access review and the PIM, etc. So because there's a lot more into that. So that's with the editions. You got free edition. You got M365, P1, and P2. Okay, so if you wanna get more details into that, into the Azure AD editions, just check out the description below. I'm gonna put on a link where you can do some more reading about it, which I actually recommend. Okay, so now let's compare Azure AD from from Active Directory domain services, which is the on-premise Active Directory. Okay, let me just clear my whiteboard. Okay, so let's put on here Azure AD and then on-premise. So, so in the exam, we may get some, you know, like a table there. If you had a experience with Microsoft Exam, so you got a table and you have to drag some, characteristics of each object here, and then you have to put in what describes them. So let's say the most common one, Azure AD, it's cloud-based. So I know they do the same thing, directory. They are both identity provider, but Azure AD is cloud-based. On-premise is local, or on-premise, as it's as the name suggests. So another thing is the query method. So if you know what LDAP is, LDAP, that's the lightweight directory access protocol. So it's like let's say you have an application, like an internal application, and you need to query the usernames or the user first names or surnames within local AD. You use LDAP for that. However, in Azure AD, LDAP doesn't work. It only it works via HTTP queries via REST APIs. So REST APIs, it's more focused into web. It's almost a web application kind of query. So we're gonna tackle that later on in this series. It's very interesting. Another thing is the the authentication protocols. So authentication. So they Azure AD do SAML, WS Federation, OpenID, and OAuth. So these are some of so if you're setting up, let's say, a single sign-on for an application, so whether be it third party or let's say internal or external, you can use these protocols for authentication within Azure AD. While in a local AD, they use Kerberos and NTLM. So those are the most common. They're more like a legacy authentication. Now, another thing is the structure. This is quite important. So Azure AD have flat structure. Oops. What does it mean by that one? So in local AD, when you want to manage users, you have to contain them in a folder or an organizational unit, OU. So that would be your solution for like containing users or computers that will end you up like having this folder structure. So like folder 1, and then under it you got OU1, OU2, and then under OU2 you can have like OU 2.2.A. So it's more like of a folder structure, while in Azure AD it's like flat. Let's say this is the let's say this is just a list. This is the database for Azure AD. So you got users here, and if you want to manage that, you just create a group and then contain the users in that group without creating folders, just to structurize that directory. They just appear as flat list. So if you search for the group here, let's say group 1, it will just give you the list of all groups with group 1 name on it. So there's Of course, you can nest groups, but it's a different concept with organizational units. Okay, so that's the bit more of comparison between Azure AD and Azure, Active Directory domain services. I'm always getting confused with those two. Okay, so let's now then discuss what are the roles in Azure AD. Let me just clear off my whiteboard. So within Azure AD, there are roles. So if if you're being confused, it's like, you have the domain admin in the local AD. So that's a role within the local AD, but it is different in Azure Active Directory. So let me just cross that off. So in Azure AD, they do have these limited administrators. Now, limited administrators, this is more of they are admins as well, but they have specific roles. It's less privileged than a full admin. So what they can do is they can manage identity tasks in a less privileged roles. Oops. Oh, sorry, my pen is playing up. So it's a manage identity. They can manage identity tasks in a less privileged roles. So identity tasks, they could be create users, create groups, put users in a group, remove user in a group. Yeah, so those are what they call identity tasks. Okay, the other one is the global administrators. They can read, modify every single administrative setting in your Azure AD organization. So they actually have the key, for everything in your Azure AD. This is the highest role that you can get, one of the highest role you can get in Azure AD. When you create a subscription in Azure, the account that you're using, that automatically becomes the global admin of that, Azure AD um, instance. Now, so they can read and modify everything in an Azure AD. So by default, keep that in mind, the person who signs up for an Azure subscription is assigned the global administrator role for the whole Azure AD organization. Also, only the global admin can delegate administrator roles. So can delegate admin roles unless there are other privileged role administrators that are actually set to delegate admin roles. Okay, but but usually it's only the global admins. So best practice, Microsoft recommend to only have five users that are assigned this role within the organization. So that's actually, I think that's a security best practice. So 5 users only. So yeah, it could be you, your manager, and the CTO of your company. So it's not. These are just the two core roles in Azure AD. Limited administrators. It's actually it's divided in a different roles. So if you wanna study it, it's actually good for the exam as well. But it's just a lot to to discuss it one by one in this video. So I'm gonna post the link below in the description so you can visit it and have a read. Um, so we know what are the built-in limited administrator roles available in Azure AD. Okay, so I think that is for now for this video. I'm gonna cut it on this. I think it's been running for long now. Now on the next video, we will be looking on the creating AD users groups, administrative units, and what are types of users, types of groups, their assignment methods. So that's going to be on the part 2 of Manage Azure Active Directory Identities. So thank you for watching. Subscribe and see you on the next one.